Good evening and welcome to Bloomsday. Thanks to everybody joining us here in Mumbai, elsewhere in India, and around the world for our special Irish-Indian contribution to the global celebration of Bloomsday. My name is Jerry Kelly and I'm the Consulate General of Ireland here in Mumbai. The Consulate is delighted to be hosting this event in association with Literature Live Mumbai. So what exactly are we celebrating today? Bloomsday refers to the day, 16th of June 1904, on which James Joyce's novel Ulysses is set, as it follows a day in the life of its protagonist Leopold Bloom and his travels around the city of Dublin. Joyce chose the date of 16th of June in honor of the first day he spent with the woman who would later become his wife, Nora Barnacle. The novel is called Ulysses because it follows the structure of Homer's Odyssey and the wanderings of its eponymous hero. Joyce reimagined Odysseus' long return home after the Trojan War as a day in the life of Dublin. The book was published in full in 1922 by Shakespeare and Company, a bookseller and publisher in Paris, established by the American-born Sylvia Beach. The rest, as they say, is history. Bloomsday itself began in Dublin in 1954 on the 50th anniversary of the events in the novel, when a group of Irish writers and academics took two horse-drawn carriages, adopted characters from the book, and followed a route around Dublin inspired by Ulysses. Today, Bloomsday is celebrated around the world wherever the Irish and lovers of great literature are to be found. And now, for the very first time, we're included here in Mumbai in this global celebration. Back in Dublin, Bloomsday is a joyful festival of all things Joycean. People celebrate Bloomsday by dressing in the fashion of the period, eating food mentioned in the book, visiting the locations where the novel takes place, and performing readings from the text. Festival events range from lectures, readings, workshops, and walking tours, to Bloomsday breakfasts, theatre, music, and pub crawls. Traditional Bloomsday must-sees are the James Joyce Martello Tower in Sandicove, Sweeney's Chemist on Lincoln Place, Glasnevin Cemetery, and Davy Byrne's Pub on Duke Street. I hope you get the chance to experience Bloomsday in Dublin for yourself someday. Obviously, this year the celebrations are a little different because of the global pandemic, and a lot of the celebrations around the world have moved online, such as here in Mumbai. I'd now like to introduce a short film made by the Irish Foreign Ministry and our embassies and consulates overseas to represent the global nature of Bloomsday in these difficult times.
A little trouble about those white corpuscles.
Csendet mindenki.
请大家肃静。
Το λευκό στήθος της νεφοσκέπας της θάλασσας.
Súběžné hlasy. 2 a 2.
Mi accarissii.
Ainein daifa. Eat gentili.
I am lonely here.
I'm lonely here.
I am, stride at a time, a very short space of time through very short times of space.
À la poursuite de la pierre philosophale.
Living all day among herbs, ointments, disinfectants.
Miski hakkab siginema. Mingit laadi üksmeel.
Faithful departed.
Faithful departed.
Faithful departed.
Poumini mlioaga.
Правоверні покойниці.
As you are now.
Borzma kadisajmi.
is many days.
La vida es muchos días.
Julelia is logodni.
This will end.
This will end.
This will end.
Nations of the earth.
Nations of the earth.
Nations of the earth.
Then you're be here who? An urshin agus ni rivishin.
El amor, ama, amar, el amor.
Возвращается год. История повторяется.
Life, love, voyage round your own little world.
But tomorrow.
Însă ziua de mâine.
Θα είναι μια καινούργια μέρα.
But tomorrow is a new day, will be.
Слънцето за тебе свети, мила, ми каза.
Yes, と私は言った。Yes, いいことよ。Yes.
Yes, I said. Yes, I will. Yes.
And we're very pleased that Mumbai was represented in that film, which compiles efforts from over 40 different embassies and consulates of Ireland around the world with their local communities to bring that short film together. Now, we're very pleased to be joined today by a distinguished Irish participant in today's discussion. James McCourt is Professor of English Literature at the University of Macerata. His most recent book is Writing the Frontier, Anthony Trollope Between Britain and Ireland. He is also the author of The Years of Bloom, Joyce in Trieste, 1904 to 1920. John has edited many volumes, including Roll Away the Real World, James Joyce in Cinema, and James Joyce in Context. He's currently working on a study of the reception of Joyce's Ulysses in Ireland as the centenary of its publication approaches. John is co-director of the Trieste Joyce School and was recently elected Vice President of the International James Joyce Foundation. I'll now hand you over to our co-host, Anil Dakar, founder and director of the Mumbai Literature Festival and Literature Live. Over to you, Anil.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you for bringing Bloomsday to India. Literature Live is very pleased to collaborate with you. I don't think we've had this event before. So when you called and said, let's do it together, I was so happy. Now, people who live in Bombay know Literature Live for the Mumbai International Literary Festival we do every November. But we also do 2 Literature Live evenings every month, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. We can't do them now, obviously, in auditoriums, we're trying to do them digitally. And I'd like to think this is one of them. Jerry, I must compliment all of you on that wonderful film, which not only gave an essence of Ulysses, but was so relevant to what we are going through now. And that to me was incredible. Incredibly moving too. I'm happy to introduce Girish Shahane, an old friend, actually a young friend. I like to think of him as a young veteran of the arts and culture. Girish has been editor of Art India. He's a cultural critic, a curator, and a columnist. And he's read Joyce at university. I'm not sure, Girish, that Joyce is now taught at universities in India any longer, but I hope he is. In any case, I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have with James McCourt. Over to you.
Thanks, Anil, and hello, John. I figure that we should begin at the end with the words that actually end Ulysses, Trieste, Zurich, Paris, 1914 to 1921, right? And Zurich and Paris are fairly well explored in Joycean studies. Trieste, maybe less so, but that is where you are based. That is where you are, if I'm not mistaken, right now, and something you have written about extensively. So could you start with giving an indication of how important Trieste was to Joyce's life, the trajectory of his life, and then the beginnings of Ulysses?
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to this Literature Live event. It's a real pleasure to be connected from Trieste to talk about Joyce, to talk about Ulysses, and to talk about the role of Trieste on this Bloomsday when we celebrate this year 98 years of Ulysses. Joyce arrived in Trieste in 1904 with his partner, Nora Barnacle, by accident. And they had been destined for Zurich, where Joyce was to take up a job as an English teacher at the Berlitz School. When they got to Zurich, he was told there was no job, and it was suggested that he travel down and try Trieste. He knew nothing about Trieste except that it was a city, a port on the sea. And so they got back on the train and they headed down across Europe. They got out of what they thought was Trieste and they went looking for the sea, and they couldn't find it. And they asked somebody, where is the sea? And somebody said, but you're not in Trieste yet. They had got off a stop too early in Ljubljana, today the capital of Slovenia. Anyway, the next day they got to Trieste, and this was to be their home for about 10 years, from 1904 to 1920, with the period in the middle in Zurich during the First World War. And these were hard years for Joyce. As his friend in Trieste, Italo Svevo, the novelist, said, the life of a gerundmonger, in other words, someone who was an English language teacher, is not a very profitable or easy one. And Joyce initially worked in the Berlitz School. He spent the early years working and trying to get Dubliners and a portrait of the artist published. And of course, that happened right as World War I was taking place. And despite those difficulties, Joyce kept the faith and began to write Ulysses. And I see Ulysses as a tale of two cities. Obviously, predominantly, it's a story, it's a novel, it's an epic all about Dublin, undoubtedly set in Dublin. But Trieste seems to me is there in the shadows. And it's particularly there in the fact that Joyce's Dublin is a far more cosmopolitan place than the Dublin Joyce had left behind, which was very provincial. That's one of the reasons Joyce had to get out of it. So Joyce was trying to suggest, I think, another Dublin. And in order to do that, he drew on Trieste, and in particular, to create the characters of Leopold and Molly Bloom. Leopold Bloom is, of course, famously descended from Hungarian Jews. He remembers hearing about his grandfather traveling across Europe through Budapest and Vienna and Milan and London before finally settling in Dublin. And he remains connected to this world of Middle Europe, but that wasn't typical of the Jewish experience in Ireland. The Irish Jewish community came from Lithuania. There were no Hungarian Jews in Ireland. So Joyce was relying on what he knew, and that was Jewish people in Trieste who telling him about their experiences. And in particular, the Italian writer Italo Svevo talking about his Jewish experiences. And similarly, Molly Bloom, who of course is half Spanish and half Irish. Her mother is Lunita Laredo, a Spanish Jewess from Gibraltar. Joyce never got near Gibraltar. The closest he got to the Mediterranean was Trieste, which is perched at the top of the Adriatic. But out of that city of Trieste, which really was a melting pot at that time, a great port for an empire, Joyce created Molly's memories of Gibraltar, when she recalls, for example, in her famous monologue, the Greeks and the Jews and the Arabs and the devil knows who else from all the ends of Europe. That's Trieste. That was Trieste, this city which was, as I say, a melting pot. What Joyce's brother Stanislaus, who lived in the city with him, called un'insalata mista, a mixed salad of a city, with elements from all over Europe who had settled there. And among those elements was one Irishman and his partner and later wife, Nora Barnacle. So Trieste played a central role for him in giving him both the distance he needed from Ireland to create Ulysses, but also providing some of the fundamental ingredients for his book that he wouldn't have found anywhere else. So that's why I try to see his Triestine years as the book calls it, the years of Bloom. In other words, the years when Joyce blossomed as a writer. He was only 22 when he got to Trieste. He was very, very young. And so he was young enough to absorb what this city could offer him. When he left age 38, he was the same age as Leopold Bloom in Ulysses. So I see Daedalus as the product of his first 22 years in Ireland, and Bloom very much a product of the hard times, the university of life that was Joyce's experience here in the Adriatic city of Trieste.
Yes, since you mentioned the age of Leopold Bloom, the age of Stephen Daedalus, traditionally Ulysses in the early years was received as, I mean, Leopold Bloom was almost seen as a satirical figure. It's impossible for us to read it now and understand why people might even think that, because he is so obviously a sympathetic personality. But they saw Stephen as Joyce, and what we learned over the years is how much of Joyce was in Bloom. Is that not? So it's, in a way, it's a double autobiography. It's there's Joyce as Stephen and Joyce as Bloom. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think Joyce is and isn't both Stephen and Bloom. He fictionalizes himself times over in his writing. He's always at the center. I think you're right to see Bloom as a comic character. And I think Joyce was very inspired by early cinema. Okay, we know that in Trieste, Joyce convinced 4 or 5 Triestine businessmen to give him the money to go back to Dublin and open Ireland's first cinema, the Volta, in 1909. So Joyce was looking at films by Georges Méliès. He was looking at Charlie Chaplin. He was looking at Buster Keaton. And I see Bloom very much in that tradition. You know, even the way we see him depicted today with his bowler hat and his black suit, he very much fits into that comic role. But you're absolutely right. There are huge elements of Joyce in the Bloom character as well. All of Bloom's desires, I suppose, for justice, because that's fundamentally what Bloom is about: fairness, justice, the belief in the individual. I think that all reflects Joyce's own beliefs, but it would be wrong to say that Bloom is in any way Leopold Bloom. He is, sorry, that Bloom is in any way James Joyce. He is a reflection of a side of James Joyce.
Yeah. To bring it to a kind of contemporary context, we are in the middle of the greatest pandemic in a century. And the last pandemic, which is comparable, really happened while he was writing Ulysses, in fact. So could you speak a little bit about the pandemic in Ulysses' time, and then perhaps as a second question about reading Ulysses in the time of pandemic?
Okay, well, it's a very relevant question. I actually wrote an article that I published this morning in the Dublin Review of Books, which people can consult online. But you're absolutely right. Joyce was writing Ulysses just as the Spanish flu was claiming the lives of 50 to 100 million people around the globe. And that pandemic was so similar, well, it was on a much greater scale, at least for the moment, to our own, as in it caused very similar symptoms and complications. And Leopold Bloom is very aware of this in the heydays chapter of Ulysses. When he thinks about scarlatina, he thinks about influenza epidemics, and he says, canvassing for death, don't miss the chance. So he thinks of all the various causes of death that were so, present in Dublin at the time, where the hygiene situation wouldn't always have been the best. And so one of Bloom's obsessions during the day, interestingly, is to go and buy soap. To go and buy soap and to stay clean, which is what we're being told to do all the time at the moment, keep washing our hands. And he's a little bit worried because Molly Bloom is about to go to Belfast on a singing tour, and there has been an outbreak in Belfast, which he feels might put her at risk. And so he's thinking about that during the cause of the day and thinks maybe she should get another vaccine so that she would be better protected from this dose that is going around. So in many ways, I think Joyce's book speaks to us very clearly. I mean, what does Ulysses do? It does in a way what COVID has done, sadly, which is to make us all very aware of the uncertainty of our lives. The only certainty at the moment is uncertainty, is a new realization, at least in Europe, that, you know, death is always around us. Mortality is very near. That's something that both Stephen and Bloom are constantly dwelling on in Ulysses. You think about how Stephen thinks about his dead mother, about how Bloom thinks about his dead suicide father, and indeed his little son Rudy, who died aged 10 or 11 days old. So they live in the shadow of death, but we all live in the shadow of death. And I think what Ulysses affirms is the value of life, which is, if you like, sharpened and made all the clearer precisely because of a kind of an awareness of death. So I think the message today of Ulysses is very important. It is to make us value every day that we have, the way Joyce values that just one day, and he turns it into an epic that is Bloomsday, as that's what we call it now. 24 hours in which he interrogates and has us think about all the things we kind of believe in. And he challenges them, he undermines them. He allows us to take nothing for granted. He teaches us to be critical. And as we try and follow news around the world, as we try and follow, you know, this pandemic and all of the propaganda that's flying around the place, I think Joyce trains us to be readers, to be critical readers at a time that is vital in this age of Twitter and fake news and all of that. So I see his I wouldn't call it a message, but I would see that one of the important things the book does is to bear witness to ordinariness, to ordinary life, and to value it a little bit more. Okay, so none of his heroes are heroes. They're absolutely not heroes. They're just ordinary people doing their best to survive and to stay afloat. He's not interested in the great events. He's not interested in wars. He's interested in peace. And he's interested in reclaiming the peace at a time in Europe where we have the Spanish flu, we have the Great War, we have in Ireland the Civil War. So turmoil around him, just as big a turmoil as we're feeling now. And yet what does he do? He focuses on one day and the importance of a couple of people, individuals, on that day, and gives great dignity, it seems to me, to their pretty regular lives.
You mentioned the soap, and Bloom, of course, has a bath at one point. And I think, if I remember correctly, that Joyce at one point said, I wish people understood how rare that act was or would have been in Dublin in 1904, with the languid floating flower, if I remember correctly.
Limp father of thousands.
Yeah. So that he sees in the bath in front of him, and he is called Bloom himself. So there are all these Joycean puns going around. But just to dial back a bit, because we have, I think, a lot of people who may not have read the novel and perhaps will be inspired to read it following this session while the pandemic still offers us a kind of window in time. So could you briefly explain or provide the schema of this very unique novel for readers who may not be perfectly familiar with it?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the problem with Ulysses is that you can get completely lost in the detail, as you know. And you could write, and people have essays just about Bloom's bar of soap or his bath, as you say. However, in the end, Ulysses tells a very simple story. And in a way, Joyce conceived it, and this is important to remember, the way he conceived his short stories in Dubliners. And the short stories in Dubliners don't function in particularly chronologically arriving at a big triumphant conclusion. They're kind of circular. They end up going back on themselves. And so Ulysses tells the story of Leopold Bloom, 38-year-old advertising agent, canvasser, and his wife, Molly Bloom, who have a daughter, Millie, They are companionable together rather than happily married. It's a bit of a compromise, but there's nothing unusual in that. And they haven't had full sexual relations in 11 years since their son died. So that's problematic. They sleep in the same bed, but his head is down beside her feet and vice versa. And they're both lacking in, I suppose, sexual love, but maybe in love in general. Bloom feels very orphaned. His father has committed suicide. He's lost his son. And so he's in search of a son. Molly is has a relationship, which we see in the novel, with another character called Blazes Boylan, who's a bit of a kind of local stallion or stud that who she enjoys, but ultimately I think finds Bloom's complexities far more interesting. And so Bloom spends the day rambling around Dublin, meeting people, talking to people, doing everything he can to stay out of the house, because he knows that his wife will be entertaining Blazes Boylan to afternoon sexual entertainment in his own bed. And so he stays out, and towards the end of the evening, he finally runs into Stephen Dedalus, who's the other principal character of the book, who is a young man who's estranged from his father. His mother is dead, and he's in search of a father figure in some way. And Bloom might be that figure. But Joyce will not, of course, entertain such an easy ending. Yes, they both go home at the end of the novel to Bloom's house on 7 Eccles Street in the chapter called Ithaca, inspired by Homer's Odyssey. But really, at the end, we conclude they don't have terribly much in common. And eventually, Stephen goes off, we don't know where. Bloom gets into bed, and he kisses Molly on the rump melanous melons of her, on the plump melanous melons, smellinous melons of her rump. He kisses her once on her bottom.
Melons, yeah.
And he falls asleep, thinking of Sinbad the sailor and Tinbad the tailor, thinking of another traveler like Odysseus. And Molly wakes up and says, well, why did he tell me to get breakfast in bed tomorrow? Well, that's not like him. And then we revisit nearly everything we've already seen in the novel, but this time through Molly Bloom's eyes and through Molly Bloom's mind and body, if you like. And the novel ends with a resounding yes, which seems to be a yes to Bloom. It's certainly a yes to life. It's certainly a yes to continuing. So if we're reading Ulysses for the plot, we will fall asleep very quickly. You don't read Ulysses for the plot. I often say, and it's a bit of an old cliche, it's a bit like drinking Guinness. You need to drink Guinness very slowly, gentle sips. And initially it might be a bit bitter and you kind of go, that's the weirdest beer I ever drank. But once you have a half a glass, you begin to acquire the taste. And you have to acquire the taste by reading slowly, by reading Joyce's book slowly, not trying to gallop through to the end. So anyone who's trying to read it right now, this is a good time to read it. Take it in short spaces. I often say read it aloud because it comes alive if you hear it read out loud. And in Penelope, in the last chapter, for example, you must read it out loud because there's almost no punctuation. And the only way to make sense of it is to hear it. So it's a very oral book, which responds brilliantly to being performed live or read aloud by a couple of readers. So a lot of people do that. Don't worry too much about the Odyssey. If you know the Odyssey, it will help you. But if you don't, you'll get through it anyway. Don't despair in the first 3 chapters, which are all about Stephen Dedalus, who's a philosopher and an intellectual and very into himself. You get to chapter 4 and finally you meet Leopold Bloom. And he's a bit of a breath of fresh air, far more down to earth. And he will grab most readers, I think. He thinks in short sentences, and there's a lot to be said for that. And he will get you through a good deal of the novel. And before you know it, you'll be halfway through and wanting to complete the marathon.
Yeah, there's still some tough. I remember Oxen of the Sun, I guess it's the 14th chapter. I might be forgetting now, but yeah, that I hit a kind of a bit of a wall. I remember when I first read Ulysses. So there are at different points, even people who love the novel will find certain chapters not necessarily, because the styles change so much. Maybe Ithaca, for example, the penultimate chapter is my favorite, but a lot of people just despise it because it has this particular question and answer catechistic form, which turns people off. But so as you say, it's a tough read. Nobody should claim it's an easy read like maybe Anthony Burgess and some people did. I don't think that works. It's a tough read. Give it time, and then it'll work. I just want to take the first question from the audience, which is quite a large question, and you can slice and dice it in the way that you want, which is, how does the history of Ireland play out in Ulysses? This is from Azra Bhagat. Thank you for the question, Azra.
Well, obviously the book is all about Ireland. It's all about Dublin in particular. And the history of Ireland is inscribed all over the book. So one of the things that I think you do need to know a little bit about, or it certainly helps, is to have some sense of Irish history and of where Ireland was in 1904. And that is, Ireland was in the aftermath of big disappointment over attempting to achieve home rule, so kind of parliamentary autonomy, which failed. And it was also in the middle of the great Irish or Celtic revival, a revival in Irish sport, a revival in Irish writing led by W.B. Yeats, a revival in the Irish language, all of which would eventually lead, I suppose, to the uprising in 1916 and to the eventual independence of Ireland. So Joyce is writing from Europe around the time of the 1916 rising and the Civil War, but he's looking back to 1904 when none of that looked like happening. He is, in a way, bearing witness to the world that was swept away as the 20th century conflicts began to happen. So it's very important to have a sense of Irish history, and Joyce was steeped in that, and he goes right back. You know, he's very proud, for example, despite his famous, you know, disavowal of Catholic belief, he's very proud of Irish monks who went to Europe spreading the Catholic faith. Saint Columbanus, for example, he sees as a predecessor to himself. So it is steeped in Irish history, but the various of the versions of Irish history are, of course, contested in the book. There is the progressive view of history, kind of an evolutionary view of history by the man who owns the school, Mr. Deasy, that Stephen works for, who sees history leading to basically eventually the revelation of God. So this idea that history is progress. And then there's Stephen's view of history, which is history is a shout in the street. History is ordinary people, the history that doesn't get written in a way. So Joyce's book, which he also refers to himself in Finnegan's Wake as a chronicle, is in itself a history of Ireland. And by the time you get to the end of it, you will be steeped in the histories of Ireland. And I say the histories of Ireland because, like everywhere else, our history is always contested. And Joyce enjoys playing with those different versions of Irish history, of this country, which in his view was twice colonized by the British, and then colonized by the Roman Catholic Church, which he always said would be harder to get rid of. And he was right. It took almost 100 years more. So he's fighting against these twin powers, which are represented in the Wandering Rocks by the Viceroy and by Father Conmee, the priest, and by their travels around the city of Dublin. So I don't know if that answers the question, which is a huge question.
Yes, and there's a follow-up almost, because Anil is asking, please talk about Joyce's relationship with the Catholic religion, which you've begun to kind of allude to already. So maybe you could expand on that a little more. Very delighted to do so.
So Joyce was educated for a start by the Jesuits. Firstly in Clongowes, the most expensive, exclusive school in Ireland, and then when the family ran out of money, he was educated in their day school, Belvedere College, and he was a very devout and religious young boy, not unlike the Stephen Dedalus that we meet in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which, by the way, anyone who wants to read Ulysses is a necessary first read because it gives you all the context that you need. But Joyce, around 15, his faith began to weaken. He has an experience in the novel, if we assume that Joyce is in some way Stephen Dedalus, with prostitutes, so the awakening of his sexuality places his whole belief in crisis. Joyce had very little time for the Irish Catholic Church, which he felt was full of ignorant priests who weren't properly educated. He had a huge amount of respect for the bigger church, for the church St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, and the church that gave so much to philosophy. And he remained fascinated by that church forever, as he did by the early Irish church, fascinated by the Book of Kells, and as I said earlier, by the Irish missionaries who went to Europe. So when his book came out, it was condemned in Ireland, especially by priests who saw it as part of evil foreign literature, which would corrupt the Irish. But the priests and the government, who worked very closely with the priests, said that we didn't need to worry because most normal people would never read Joyce anyway. It's funny you asked this question, because about a half an hour before we connected today, I got a message from an Irish bishop who is in the Vatican wishing me a happy Bloomsday, a happy feast day. Joyce has become very acceptable now in Ireland as Catholicism has changed so drastically and so dramatically. And in a way, Bloomsday has become like a kind of an alternative feast day in Ireland, and a kind of a secular feast day, taking the place of St. Patrick's Day, or maybe taking its place beside St. Patrick's Day. So that's a very interesting development that has happened. So Joyce always said, don't refer to me as a Catholic, at most call me a Jesuit, because he believed he had that kind of formation of the Jesuits, which was never simple or never straightforward, and was deeply intellectual.
Yeah. There's a scene, the No God from Ireland scene. I remember getting sort of goose pimples when I read that. It's very difficult to pull that kind of scene off, because it's not just about religion, but it's also about politics and the merging of religion and politics. And that plays a very, very strong role in India. So for me as an Indian reading Joyce, the kind of connection between Catholicism and the politics of Ireland did have many resonances, also colonialism, the presence of the British. And so at the political level, I always found it very wise that he maintained this distance from both the British Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, that he had these two masters. And the danger I find even to this day is often the idea that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so you gravitate to one of these poles rather than maintaining that kind of balance and distance from both of them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can only agree.
Well, Mort Chatterjee has a sort of follow-up question along the religious thread, but going more into the mystical side of it. He is interested in Joyce's references to Theosophy, because references, he says, seem to pop up frequently during the book. So is that something that you have looked into? Indians are obviously very connected with Theosophy. So they'd be very interested in your take on that. Okay,
I'm the wrong person for this question. When I think of Theosophy, I tend to think more of W.B. Yeats and A.E. George Russell, who of course both appear in Ulysses, and Bloom makes fun of them. He is very suspicious of Theosophy. He thinks it's a bit airy-fairy. Joyce made fun of everything he took seriously, if that makes sense. The fact that Joyce made fun of something, believed it was worth making fun of. And Theosophy is among those things. So I wouldn't discount his interest in it, but I'm not going to pretend to be able to give a proper answer to that question.
Sure. So we'll move on. And on a very different note, Hemant Divate is asking, it would be interesting to know the struggle of the book getting published and read. So if you could talk of the publishing history just briefly of Ulysses.
Yeah. This is a very sad and complicated story, as are all of the stories of Joyce's publication histories. If you just go back for a second to Dubliners, which he published in 1914, just as World War I started, he signed a contract which said he must sell in that year 500 copies in order to be paid rights. Joyce's book sold 499 copies. He bought 120 of them himself and sold them to his students in Trieste. He didn't get a penny in rights. Then, of course, he began to publish Ulysses in installments, thanks to Ezra Pound, both in The Egoist in Britain and, of course, in the Little Review in New York. And the Society in New York for the Prevention of Vice decided that Joyce's book was unsuitable reading and shouldn't be carried by the US postal system. And they took particular offense at his Nausicaa episode, which sees Leopold Bloom masturbating on the beach. So we can see how they might find that offensive. The result was that the serialization of Joyce's Ulysses stopped, and then he couldn't find a publisher, essentially, who was willing to take the book on. There was a pirated version by Samuel Roth, which was notoriously unreliable version, and Roth made quite a bit of money out of it. And there was poor old Joyce going from publisher to publisher, trying to convince someone to publish it. And as Jerry said at the beginning, in the end, he was saved by Sylvia Beach of Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Now, Sylvia Beach was not a publisher. She owned a bookshop, but she formed a publishing house with the aim of publishing just one book, which was Joyce's Ulysses. And initially it was published in very expensive numbered versions, signed by the author, just maybe 100 or 200 or 300. And then you had to buy it through mail order, and it was posted privately to you. So it was a long time. And of course, sometimes those mail orders would be seized by the police in Britain and in Ireland and in the United States. Now, Sylvia Beach was extremely generous to Joyce and gave him huge advances on the eventual rights, far more than he probably was supposed to get, to help keep him afloat. Eventually, a proper commercial edition came out, and several with a Bodley head, and there were several new editions of it. It was being updated all the time as Joyce tried to fix his text. Because the other thing about the Sylvia Beach, Shakespeare and Company, Joyce Ulysses is that Joyce sent off the book to the publisher in France. Of course, Ulysses is in English. When the proofs came back to Joyce, not only did he correct the mistakes, but he added about 1/3 to the book in his terrible handwriting. And so we have a French typographer who doesn't speak English trying to insert Joyce's corrections and additions. And so it's not surprising that the early editions of Ulysses are notoriously unreliable and full of mistakes. And gradually Joyce, if you like, weeded out these mistakes. But it was a very long, hard struggle to get it into print and to overcome the ban, particularly in America. I might say one thing: Catholic Ireland did not ban Ulysses because they didn't think they needed to. They came to the very smug conclusion that nobody in Ireland would read it anyway, and banning it would only draw attention to it.
He had, apart from Sylvia Beach, he had a benefactor, Harriet Shaw Weaver, and we hear stories of her presenting him with £12,000 at one stage, and the manuscript being sold for £2,000 by another person. And so how much, I mean, £12,000 seems like a lot of money if we think of inflation over 100 years. Is it as much as we would think it is? Like, would it make him a rich man to have £12,000?
Well, Joyce was useless with money. And the more he had, the more he spent. And, you know, both he and Nora were terrible housekeepers. They didn't, you know, some people will put away their clothes at the end of the season, the summer season, and put them away for the winter and wash them and iron them and then take. Joyce, as far as I can see, they wore the clothes till they fell off them. And if Joyce had money, he would spend it. He would go to the best restaurants in Paris. If he went to the cinema, he would leave a tip, which was like, I don't know, maybe to the person who showed him to a seat, he'd give that person in today's terms $50, with Nora tearing her hair out saying, what are you doing? So he was very generous with other people's money. And Harriet Shaw Weaver was hugely important in recognizing, I suppose, Joyce's great gift and enabling him to live the kind of life that he lived. He never lived in luxury, but he did eat out every night of his life. And not many of us can afford that every night of our lives. So he lived beyond, I think it's fair to say, beyond his means. I couldn't put a number on what Harriet Shaw Weaver gave him over the years, but I'd say we're talking £500,000 anyway. He was always looking for more.
Yeah,
probably something like that.
Money. Yeah.
But I don't quote me on that figure, but it was a very significant figure.
Yes, yes. It seems like when you read it, when I read biographies and I read these figures and try and calculate inflation, it feels like a lot of money. And yet you keep having this sense, of course, in Trieste, he was indigent for a while, was he not? He had a salary as a teacher, but that was not enough to cover expenses. But later on as well, he, as you say, but what you've said explains quite a bit to me, that he was so bad with money. And it's a long time since I read the Ellman biography, so I've forgotten these details.
Yeah, I find it funny that in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom keeps his, in Ithaca, your favorite chapter, and possibly mine, he keeps his daily budget, and it's quite carefully totted up. But that certainly wasn't reflecting Joyce's own practice, which was live for the moment, and we'll worry about paying for it tomorrow. So yeah, and his father was the same. He inherited that spendthrift habits from his father, and in fact, he depicts, I think, very movingly in Ulysses, the poverty of his own family in Ireland. When you see Stephen Dedalus's sisters trying to get some money from the father, the alcoholic father, just so they can go and buy food, it's pretty tragic. So he was well aware of what poverty was, because he lived it, as you say, in Trieste. And in Trieste, he was saved, though, by his brother, who did all the hard work and paid most of the bills.
Yeah. There's the question, I mean, this takes us on a different track again, but we have a limited time, so I think it's all right to jump a bit. How is Joyce's language different from that of his contemporaries? How justified is it to club his literary technique with that of other modern writers? This is Jaya asking the question. Thanks, Jaya. So a little about his contemporaries and the influences. Yeah.
Well, Joyce borrows from everybody, okay? And a bit like W.B. Yeats, who says, "Talk to me of originality and I will turn on you with rage." There is nothing original. So what do? You go back to the Odyssey and you retell that story and you try to make it new, as Ezra Pound so famously said about the whole modernist effort. So Joyce was a great recycler of other people's material. I mean, Shakespeare is all over his work, is all over Ulysses. Dante is all over his work. He borrowed from here and from there, but he wrote a 700-page novel with the attention that a poet will write a 14-line sonnet, except that he keeps that up for all those pages. And famously, in Frank Budgeon's book about the writing of Ulysses, he was a friend of Joyce's in Zurich. He recalls how somebody came to Joyce one day and said, "Well, Mr. Joyce, did you get any writing done today?" And Joyce says, "Yes, absolutely, great day. I wrote a sentence." And the guy said to him, "But can you not find the words?" And Joyce said, "No, I have all the words. The problem is finding the order for the words." So I think there's a huge amount in the use of language, in the order of words, in frustrating what the reader predicts is going to come. And Joyce did say, as a good Irish anti-colonial writer, writing in English is the most ingenious torture ever invented. Having to write within the limits of the English language for an Irishman conscious that we had lost our language, Irish, and someone so well versed in all the European languages, being reduced to the straightforwardness of the English language, subject, verb, object. The man kicked the cat. There's only one way to say that in English, but in other languages, there's lots and lots of different ways to say it. And Joyce pushes English to its limits. He reclaims English and he makes it this new language, which is all his own. So it's just that attention to detail. And just when the reader in Ulysses is getting comfortable in an episode, Joyce finishes it and you find yourself in the new episode and everything has changed. All the rules are gone and you have to figure out the new rules in the new episode. Yeah. So it's a fantastic exploration of the limits and the potential of language.
We're kind of coming to the end. I think if there are a couple, there's one question I want to ask, and then we'll go on to a very general question that's been asked about how do you differentiate between plagiarism and good literature? I don't know if you want to take that. You're welcome to, if you can relate it to Joyce, but it seems not to necessarily be a Joycean question. How do you relate? How do you differentiate between plagiarism and good literature?
Well, plagiarism is when you borrow material from other people, you don't acknowledge it, and you don't do anything with it. So it's secondhand. Now, everything in Joyce is secondhand, but if we go back to the classics, it was all about imitation. It was all about learning from the writers that came before you, and then trying to do something that's somehow worthy of the great literature of the past. It's not this romantic kind of an instinct whereby you can invent everything from nothing. It's the acknowledgement that there are methods of writing, just as there are methods of painting and of musical composition that we need to learn in order to break every rule in the book. Because Joyce uses all of the material available, breaks every rule in the book, quotes every author ever going, and we scholars spend our time identifying all of that and create something entirely new. And I think it's the entirely new that lifts this beyond plagiarism.
Yeah, and come back as a final question, or the penultimate question maybe, to what you were talking of reading. There was a reader's edition, I think, of Joyce about 20 years ago, which tried to make this language that you speak of a little simpler. Like famously, I think it's looking glass is used as one word, but the editor broke up those words and changed a couple of the passages, and it became a huge scandal. I mean, for me, I don't see how these little marginal differences are really going to make it more readerly. But do you have anything to say about these efforts by editors to make a sort of user-friendly Ulysses?
I think it's an act of vandalism. Joyce's work is what it is. It won't be for everyone, and that's fine. I don't think you can really simplify Ulysses without taking away its complexity. It just, the thing falls apart. So I think one of the other things that editor did was to punctuate the entire last episode. But that's not necessary. If you read it carefully and out loud, it punctuates itself. That's not to say that there are not difficulties, as you said, and that we won't as readers get lost in the darkness, for example, of Holles Street Hospital and Oxen of the Sun and its journey through the English language from the beginnings up to modern day. And that won't be, for a lot of people, a tiresome episode, a difficult episode. And when we all hit a wall when we're reading Ulysses, but the answer to that is not to simplify it. It's like the marathon is 26 miles long. If we make it 20 miles long, it's not a marathon anymore. It's something else. So I'm not in favor.
Not in favor at all. Yes, let's do it, and let's do it the way it was meant to be done, however difficult it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. You have been, I mean, the passion and the clarity that you have brought to this conversation is really incredible. I think I learned a lot from this, and thanks again to the Ireland Consulate and Literature Live for arranging this. And I'd like to bring back Jerry and Anil at this point for some final comments, and maybe they have a question to ask you, and then we'll wind up.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Yeah.
Jerry, may I go first? I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, please go ahead, Anil.
James Joyce was buried in Zurich, and there was a move to bring the bodies back to Ireland. What's the position now?
The position is that James Joyce is very happily buried in Zurich with his wife and has no intentions of going anywhere and didn't want to go back, as far as we know, to Ireland. There was a movement in Ireland this year, you're absolutely right, the idea of repatriating him. We don't need to bring him back to Ireland for him to in some way belong to Ireland. He chose exile. He chose 40 years out of Ireland, his entire adult life. And he has a beautiful grave in the Fluntern Cemetery in Zurich. I would personally be very much in favor of leaving him in peace. What I wouldn't mind seeing happen is seeing his daughter, who's in Northampton in England, very much on her own, being brought back over to Zurich to join them. But I think Joyce is just fine where he is. That's my own take on it.
Right.
And there's always the risk, by the way, if you bring him home, that you get it wrong. I mean, we still don't know if the Yeats they brought home is really Yeats.
Do you see any resonance in about today in Ulysses, about what's happening today all around us?
Well, I think earlier I talked a little bit about, you know, the moment that Joyce was writing that book in, of great uncertainty. And I think we're in a very similar moment of terrible uncertainty. I think this moment is worse, actually, because of the environmental issues. But I think more than ever, we have to question everything we're told because of the way news is fed to us. And I think, you know, one of the great messages of the Aeolus chapter of Ulysses is about the power of rhetoric in pushing empty messages and untrue messages and biased messages and fake news, to use that awful term. So I think it speaks to us today as much as it did 100 years ago, because I believe, as Richard Ellman said, that we're still learning to become Joyce's contemporaries. He was way ahead of us. We're catching up. And it took Ireland 40 years to realize that Joyce was actually relevant and not just a nuisance. And I think Ireland is learning a lot from, I think he suggested a new Ireland, which is not totally dissimilar from the Ireland that we're trying to construct now. Much more open, cosmopolitan place. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a very different country to the country that Joyce rejected.
Right. Well, that was a lovely conversation, John and Girish. Over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jerry?
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, John and Girish. It would be interesting, just as a final comment from John, what he thinks Joyce would have made of Bloomsday being such a national event in Ireland now and spreading globally, and having basically being used by the Irish state to promote the country of Ireland. Given Joyce left Ireland and never, as you say, never really seriously contemplated returning, felt he was better off out of the Ireland that he left, which obviously is quite a different place than the Ireland we now live in. But his views on Bloomsday, I think, would be quite interesting. But what do you think he would have made of it, the way it's grown?
Yeah, it's very dangerous to speak for Joyce, obviously. I think part of him would have been delighted to see that finally, you know, he said one day they will raise a statue to me in Ireland. He did think it would take a long time. And he, of course, kept complaining when he was publishing his books that nobody in Ireland was paying any attention. I'd say he would have a worry that what you just said, that the country would use him and exploit him for some kind of global branding, rather than actually, you know, allow for the radical, complicated nature of his works and the questions they ask us. So, you know, the idea of glorifying him without really taking the time to understand him, you know, the trotting out of a quote here and there and everywhere, which has now become so popular. I mean, everybody is in on the Bloomsday Act. And I just hope it helps. I basically think it's a good thing, but I think it's a good thing if it helps people to read Joyce ultimately. I think that's important. That it's not just about putting on a silly tie and walking around Dublin and looking like an extra from Ulysses. Although Bloomsday is great fun in Dublin, and there's a great fun in Joyce's Ulysses, and I love that fun and the humor of his book. So I'd say he'd have mixed feelings, and he would tell us to go and read the thing.
John, do you have a quote from Ulysses ready which you can read?
Do I have a quote from Ulysses? Give me a second.
Well, I think that's a very interesting take from John, as Ulysses is, and Bloomsday is very much part of Ireland promoting itself. We promote culture, tourism, and all aspects of the country. This is one of the days that we as diplomats globally try and present our best face to the world using Joyce and Ulysses and Irish culture as a way to do that. But the other point, I just build on what John said there, I think I'm always very happy to come from a country and represent a country where we celebrate literature, where it is a public celebration of literature. And I think Joyce, while he may be not overly keen on the idea of being co-opted by the state and the establishment, would be pleased about the idea that the country he left celebrates literature and culture to such an extent in his honor, as we've been doing here today.
I think that's right. I think he'd be very pleased that we have a president who's also a poet and who values literature and the arts and uses Bloomsday every year to assert the necessity of the arts as a means to make us ask questions of ourselves and our society. And that's what literature is about. And it's very easy, as you say, Jerry, to just write it all off. But I do think in the end of the day, it shocks me, really, not shocks, but it surprises me how many people genuinely are engaging with Joyce's work and taking on Ulysses and reading it and seeing what it's saying to us today. You know, it's very encouraging. It's wonderful. And you're right. It's pretty unique. So I could read a bit of the fourth chapter. I wasn't expecting to do this, but I won't read very much because I don't want to go on too long.
No, very short quote to end this session. I think that would be appropriate.
Okay. I'll just read the beginning of chapter of the Calypso episode, Leopold Bloom. It's when he's introduced and we hear about what he likes to eat. Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roast heart, liver slices fried with crust crumbs, fried hen cod's roes. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. I don't want to finish with urine, so I'll read the next bit. Kidneys were in his mind as he moved about the kitchen softly, writing her breakfast things on the humpy tray. Gelid light and air were in the kitchen, but out of doors, gentle summer morning everywhere. Made him feel a bit peckish. We can stop on peckish.
Yeah.
And apologies to all the vegetarians who might be listening.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you so much.
Not at all. You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody who asked questions. I'm sorry for the couple that we were not able to carry. We ran out of time, but really appreciate your attention. And thank you again, Literature Live and the Embassy and Consulate Ireland.
And thank you, Girish, and thank you, John, for helping us make this our first Bloomsday in Mumbai. And we hope next year we'll be able to do this in a more physical presence.
Right. All right.